Sorry about the dog.
You should show us your
I
dog.
should definitely show
Can you
us
show
your
us your dog?
Yeah.
Can you show us your
Yeah.
dog?
Unfortunately, there are two.
Okay.
And one
What
of
is
them
it?
is the one that's been around, and this is Ewok. Ewok is, of course, the appropriate name for a dog on a nerd show.
Oh my
Whoa.
gosh.
The other one is a puppy, a pandemic puppy.
Yeah.
That's torturing everyone, including this dog.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, too bad, but cute. Our guest today is Zeyneb Magavi. Welcome.
I'm glad you're on the show.
I'm glad to be here. There's nothing better than a nerd show.
Nothing
Right,
better.
Nothing better.
What are you going to talk about today?
Well, I thought I'd be a very risk-taking nerd and talk about a graph that isn't mine and requires a lot of explanation.
Is that the flattening the grid load?
Yeah.
Can you walk us through it?
So first of all, I want to give credit where credit is due. And this was shared with me by the Gray Edge group, which is a wonderfully hilarious bunch of nerds out in Utah and Colorado that you should probably meet at some point. And one of them, Kerry Smith, around 2009, he likes to play around with things. And he did a really novel geothermal install at a growing college campus, Colorado Mesa University. We met him when we issued a request for proposals for a feasibility study for our networked geothermal proposal. And we're really, really, really totally delighted to discover he'd done something really close to what we were proposing already, and that we could actually find out it already worked. And along the way, he shared this graph, and this isn't a graph that he made either. The story is that Xcel Energy, in the middle of the country, knew that the college was growing in leaps and bounds. In fact, the time period represented on the graph is about 3 years, and they grew from 800,000 square feet to 1,200,000 square feet of space. This is great for Colorado. They're getting more educated people. So Xcel Energy sent this graph. It didn't have the 800,000 square foot labels or the box drawn, but they sent it and said, what the hell is going on? What are you doing? Because they had planned for a normal and comparable load growth to go with the square footage growth as the college was adding buildings. And when they saw this graph, they didn't understand what had happened. And they sent it to them, and Kerry got gleeful, and he shared it with me as well. As you can see, despite the college growing and adding buildings and square footage, their annual load profile for these 3 years is staying remarkably flat. And I should say that the nerd risk I'm taking is that I can tell you a lot about the gas system and a lot about geothermal. And I am like a neophyte on the electric grid.
So these are peak load in megawatts, and I'm guessing each dot is a month.
Each dot is a month. The red lines differentiate the years, roughly. The dots that are above that little rectangle he drew in, those are coincidentally when the students arrive. Apparently it's their busiest time of year, September.
Back when students used to arrive at campuses.
Right, back then, yes.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's why it's peaking in September, October.
Yep. Xcel Energy wanted to understand what was going on. And so we met with them and tried to explain it. The reason I love this graph is because it shows us the potential of transitioning our gas system into a networked geothermal system to accelerate electrification. So as we face electrification and need it at the speed and scale that, well, we're honestly not doing it. And that causes all kinds of challenges across the whole spectrum. If we have a way to flatten the grid load like this, and furthermore, to be able to manage it. And one thing you'll love to hear is that the control system for this networked geothermal install at this university, it has this button in the bottom corner, which looks a lot like some kind of video game. And the button says system load shed, and you push it and the whole thing stops drawing electricity across the whole thing, right? It just coasts. So when Xcel Energy says that they've got a peak, they pay for load shedding on peak. And the college is making a lot of money happily pushing that button whenever there's a peak and having no consequences on their campus in terms of their thermal needs.
That's amazing. So I met some of these Great Edge Group folks when you had your all-day symposium. And as I recall, a few of them have a background in the fossil fuel industry. And I'm curious about this because as we're talking about the work that HEET is doing and thinking about these major transitions that are happening, there are some lessons that can be shared among the industries. I mean, but it also seems like a little bit of a philosophical conflict, or no? What do you think?
I find it fascinating. Carrie and Garen and them, they are ex-oil drillers. That's where they started. They joke around, they say they're atoning for their sins, but they switched to geo decades ago and realized the potential of their toys, their drills, to do something much more interesting to them as engineers and more sustainable. And they've got kids, they care about the future. And, it's a really interesting reality that there's a lot of folks out there who work in the current fossil fuel industry who need jobs and care about the future. And having good jobs like this, taking our fracking drillers and turning them to a different drill and making them geo, why not?
And it's all just energy and pipes and thermodynamics.
If you look at the gas industry as an industry that is currently serving the population by providing heat, then ditch the gas, ditch the fossil fuels with all of its problems, and have them serve the population by delivering heat.
It reminds me a little bit of how Texas, in my mind, got so much wind power, and it's because of people like T.B. Pickens who understood you can make money on energy, and whether you're burning coal to make electricity or doing something else, it's still making money doing energy.
I mean, we can debate the whole system of capitalism, but given the system we're in, I think using it to transform is probably the fastest way forward.
Do you want to tell us about the other graph?
I actually am wondering if I should be fair to the viewers and explain what the hell a district geothermal system is. Geothermal is just another ground source heat pump. The word geothermal really sucks because it means like 3 or 4 different technologies, which is really confusing. So only way to decarbonize heat pumps, air source heat pump, ground source heat pump. We're adding a third category, networked heat pumps. I don't care if it's an air source or a ground source, but we're proposing to network ground source heat pumps. By networking, we tap into a huge aspect of energy sharing. So we start harvesting both the wasted energy and the used energy. So by connecting all of our ground source heat pumps in a shared loop underground and having it be ambient and bidirectional, we're able to load cancel across the different buildings, which in some case studies is as much as 40% reduction in energy use, which is a new kind of energy efficiency. And by having utility scale in the street, we get the gas utility a new business model, and we use their financing mechanisms and their basically socialization of energy to provide equitable, low-cost access to decarbonized thermal. And we also add air conditioning, which everyone needs now, unfortunately. And so there's closed-loop vertical geothermal boreholes in the street or in other accessible places, which are brought onto and off of the system as needed to keep the loop temperature in balance in a design temperature window. That design temperature window is basically the perfect spot to keep the heat pumps happy. So you keep your heat pumps operating at maximum efficiency right in that sweet spot by managing the temperature. And your managing mechanisms are the borehole array, which is an energy storage mechanism that can store energy over a year, and also by bringing sources and sinks on and off the system as needed. So you can evolve with a changing climate by adding more sources or sinks.
So it's really interesting, and I have a ton of questions, but one word you mentioned, equity. The word has been around in education in a lot of different fields for decades and decades, but it's really big in energy right now. And so I'm curious about this sort of distributed model and what is equitable about it. And I mean, it's more distributed than, these big infrastructure projects.
So I probably shouldn't use the word socialization, but in learning about utilities, I did start to realize that one of the greatest utilities of a utility was that it puts in the energy infrastructure and spreads the cost out, not just over time, but also over a population. And so those most vulnerable people with, low income in environmental justice communities, the elderly, they don't have to pay the full rate. As we all know, there's a discount rate, and they don't have to pay for the whole system over time or have the financing. They can just get a monthly energy bill that is lower cost, and that allows access to everyone.
In some ways, the grid is really about sharing.
It is totally about sharing, and this is kind of the sharing economy for thermal energy.
One thing that you mentioned was it sounds like there's potential for seasonal. We're talking about spreading heating and cooling loads over time, and as we do more and more electricity on the grid and renewable electricity generation on the grid, there's issues around storage, and can we store for 4 hours or 8 hours or 3 days, and so something that actually gets you on the scale of months in terms of moving loads around seems like it'd be pretty useful.
We actually debated, like, okay, so how do we pitch this? Do we pitch it as, a replacement for gas, or do we pitch it as an energy storage mechanism? The Earth is the largest battery we have, the longest term, lowest cost battery, and it's already being used. Like, that's what this is all about, is we're just taking energy from the sun. The sun has warmed the crust of the Earth to that steady temperature, and the Earth, with its particular characteristics, the bedrock particularly, of holding heat, is basically holding the sun energy over time. And that's why it's a stable 55 around here if you go 6 feet down. So we're just tapping into that. And if you put in a borehole thermal energy array, you can call it a B test, borehole thermal energy storage. And then there's A test, which is like storing it in water, aquifer thermal energy storage. Both of them, if you have a large enough thermal grid to use that scale, can be by far the cheapest, longest term, low cost energy. So the idea is like, okay, you have wind energy at night that no one wants. So dump it into your thermal grid, into your borehole thermal energy array, your loop, raise the temperature by a little bit, and then pull that temperature down during a peak later.
Imagine if Texas had quads of energy stored in the ground going into February.
Oh my gosh, it would have been so much better.
Yes, so seriously, Texas, that would have been awesome. And I think a destabilized climate swings wildly, right? And also our climate is changing. So we're in Massachusetts going to be a cooling climate before the end of the century. So I think that part where it's like Lego blocks, like you can add and subtract components, and the management of the thermal energy is central, allows us to build a renewable energy system that can evolve and meet the wildly swinging challenges that are ahead, unfortunately.
Well, I was going to ask about this next graph.
Okay, yes. And I stuck that in. I realize it does not look like it follows the first one, does it?
Well, I'm thinking it has to do with like balancing, like you got the heating loads and the cooling loads. And if you do things right, then there's opportunity to be incredibly efficient.
So this is like the underlying paradigm of what causes that first graph to happen. So HEET hired Bureau Happold Engineering to do our feasibility study for Massachusetts, and they very kindly broke down the entire Massachusetts gas system into 4 representative street segments, and those are the ones you can see on the left. And then they used large-scale energy use data, and Eversource actually helped them with that directly with real customer data to create an average energy use for each of those average street segments. While you might think that trying to build a network geothermal in the highest density mixed use areas would be the hardest, what is really fun about this graph is that the goal is not to think about peak load when you're designing network geothermal. You're switching the underlying paradigm of HVAC design. And engineers just really just stare at me with this one, like, wait, but what about peak load? No, forget peak load. You're trying to design to balance point, and your maximum savings, your maximum benefit, your ease of building this are around balance annually between heating and cooling. So this bottom one with the highest energy load, the mixed use, high density, is actually the most attractive to build a geomicrodistrict for your first geomicrodistrict, because you can balance it over time. You're basically creating a passive house-like system for a network of homes instead of for a single home.
Way easier.
And I'd imagine that a fair portion of the cost of these systems is digging in pipes. If the buildings and the people are closer together, you got more people closer together, maybe it's less expensive pipes.
Yeah, your infrastructure, that balance point means you need less infrastructure per demand, right? And then also you're distributing the cost of the infrastructure over more people.
What should people know about what you're up to and how this is going to work?
So much. But the exciting part is that the gas industry is under an existential threat, and they see this as a potential path forward. And so by providing them an opportunity like this to drive with us towards a decarbonization, I think we can all get there faster. And there are 2 pilots going in the ground in Massachusetts and a whole bunch in consideration all over the Northeast and Minnesota and Colorado. And I think if we don't screw it up along the way, we have a really good shot of being able to really accelerate electrification by taking the burden of decarbonization of heat off of the electric grid in part, while providing additional electric grid services. And I think if we see it as a whole system, instead of seeing these things as separate energy systems, but instead integrate them, we just get a lot more for our effort and our money, and it's safer. It's more resilient and more equitable. And we get the gas workers to have good jobs in geo. So that's part of a just transition. And why not also integrate with the water and sewer systems as thermal sources and sinks?
I've been thinking that the pieces of this seem like things people have been doing for a long time, right? Like district heating. And then there's, air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps. And so, we know how to do this. It's more like putting the pieces together. Or maybe there are some pieces that are new and innovative.
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. So I was just recently taught by an awesome guy named Jajenkia that the term for this kind of innovation is architectural innovation, because every component already exists, is tested, and is really not a risk. It's just put together differently, which means that the entire thing is not a question of does this work? It's more a question of like, where are the thresholds, how much, where, when, how do we do it? And how do we bring everyone with us and make sure all of the benefits are distributed equally so that the system drives forward together? And there is one part that is a new component, and that is you can hook this all up without any kind of complexity, and it can work just like it did in Colorado Mesa. But I think that we can get even more out of it if we see it as an internet of energy, and see the electric energy objects and the thermal energy objects as all sources and sinks in the same energy network, and have edge computing with localized decision making for all of them with data streams. I'm going off a little, sorry. But I think that the optimization software and the opportunity to connect all of these and optimize for greenhouse gas, for cost, and for load leveling over time is something we haven't done yet. But we have the capacity, we can do it. But that's where we're going to need some innovation.
Seems like a great application of machine learning and AI.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
You mentioned gas workers. We have a neighbor who's a gas worker, and she is very young. And I think we might have to get you two together so that she and people in her generation have a chance to know about this sooner rather than later.
That would be really awesome. I actually spent a summer out with the gas worker trucks, getting to know people. And yeah, there's a lot of concern among the young people for their future.
Well, thanks, Zeyneb.
Yeah.
It was really interesting. Thanks for being on the show.
Really fun. We might have to have you back because we have a lot of questions, but
I'd be happy to have another conversation. Bye. See you soon.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for watching. This is Energy Nerd Show and Tell.
It's the show that we want to watch. So we're thinking maybe some of you energy nerds want to watch it too. If you do, then tell your friends and subscribe right around here. Click there.
And check
or there. Or over here.
Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and where else?
Yeah, and the Energy Nerd website at energynerdshow.com. You can always go there. And if you want to be a guest, you can volunteer to be a guest. We love to have guests. In fact, that's kind of what the show is all about.
Absolutely.